Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to fundamentally shift how we look at complex national problems. We aren't relying on the usual political talking points or, endless media spin. Instead, we're using hard statistical data and behavioral signs to map exactly how different minds process the exact same global challenges. Get ready, because we're about to uncover the hidden psychological architecture behind our biggest policy debates. Okay, let's dive into this. We'll start by looking at the singular threat assumption. Then, we'll check out a really fascinating systemic data anomaly, explore divergent value interpretations, see what happens when adaptive governance fractures, dig into AI and dynamic modeling, and finally, talk about designing systemic policy. All right, Section 1. The singular threat assumption. I want you to think about how national policy debates usually frame really big, large-scale issues. You've probably seen this equation presented across the entire political spectrum. This idea that illegal immigration equals a standalone national crisis that requires direct, border-focused solutions. It's a very linear assumption, right? But is this framing actually effective, or is it kind of blinding us to a much wider reality? Let's unpack this mystery. Moving into Section 2, the systemic data anomaly. To answer that question, let's pivot straight to some hard statistical data. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this number right here, -0.0734. It's a fascinating anomaly. This is a Pearson correlation from global SDTEST polls. Basically, it measures the relationship between people who prioritize illegal immigration as a top crisis and people who align with what Spiral Dynamics calls the yellow vMEME. The yellow stage represents a mindset that's highly focused on complex adaptive systems. And because that correlation is negative, it means the more a person uses this advanced systemic thinking, the less likely they are to view this issue as just a standalone crisis. And just to be absolutely clear, this isn't some small, localized fluke. This data spans 99 countries and 22 languages with a massive sample size of over 2,000 people. It easily surpasses this student critical value of 0.043 for mathematical reliability. Now, while it doesn't strictly imply causation, it is a huge, mathematically valid signal. The data is definitively telling us that systemic thinkers process this issue entirely differently than the general public. So what is this yellow stage doing instead? Well, they aren't just dismissing the reality of borders or ignoring the challenge. Actually, it's more like they are actively resisting reductive zero-sum framings. Instead of a fortified wall focus, they filter the world through systemic interdependence. They see migration not as an isolated threat, but as an embedded variable within a highly interconnected global system, one that's driven by economics, climate, and adaptive global flows. Let's actually walk through a cross-stage comparison to prove this. When we test the yellow vMEME against other issues, a super clear picture emerges. While they deprioritize the singular threat of illegal immigration at -0.0734, look at what they do prioritize. Climate change at a positive 0.1083, infrastructure at positive 0.0961, affordable healthcare at positive 0.0681. This totally highlights the anomaly. The yellow psychological profile heavily prioritizes issues it views as massive, interconnected systems, which absolutely confirms they're applying a systemic complexity filter to everything. Okay, Section 3. Divergent value interpretations. So what exactly happens when you introduce the exact same national problem to completely different psychological profiles? Well, you get what behavioral science calls the prediction gap. A single issue refracts into totally different cognitive logics based on a population's spiral dynamics profile. As we just established, yellow sees migration as embedded in global systems requiring adaptive, multi-level responses. But the blue stage, which is focused on order and rules, sees it primarily as a matter of rule enforcement and border integrity. Meanwhile, the red stage, driven by power and survival, perceives it as a direct threat to sovereignty, resources, or cultural identity. It's literally three distinct groups, looking at the exact same variable and seeing three completely different realities.
Which brings us to Section 4, when adaptive governance fractures.
This leads us to an absolutely critical question. What is the consequence when leaders force a one-size-fits-all narrative? Well, adaptive governance fractures. When complex system puzzles are treated merely as singular threats, the behavioral data suggests the yellow profile experiences systemic blindness and integrative anchor loss. Basically, society loses its integrative thinkers who just tune out of the debate completely. Then, the public discourse fragments violently across competing value systems. Ultimately, trust in governance completely erodes because the proposed solutions feel simplistic and reactive rather than truly adaptive to the real world. Let's move to and see how this builds.
because this fracture isn't usually a dramatic overnight failure. It's more of a quiet cascade. It starts at step 1 with what the framework calls reductive framing. That immediately creates systemic blind spots at step 2. And because you can't see the whole board, you enter step 3, policy drift, where initiatives misalign with on-the-ground realities, which ultimately leads to step 4, a silent coordination collapse. The system fails to adapt, but leadership often doesn't realize it until it's way too late.
Section 5, AI and Dynamic Modeling.
But, hey, there is a solution to this governance fracture. By feeding these thousands of psychological correlations into dynamic programming models, we can predict exactly how different groups will react to policy changes. The dynamic modeling confirms that yellow dominant groups need to see embedded variables in complex adaptive systems to buy in. Blue dominant groups need rule enforcement and procedural boundary clarity, and red dominant groups need sovereignty protection and resource management. The mathematical conclusion here is inescapable. Universal problem framing is doomed to fail in policy. You simply have to navigate the varied psychological states of your population simultaneously.
And this brilliantly illustrates a fascinating 2026 trend, AI vibe coding. Basically, users are now instructing LLMs in natural language to build apps without traditional code. What we're looking at is an AI-assisted policy analytics dashboard built exactly this way. It maps vMEME interpretations and acts as an interactive systemic complexity filter. But here's the catch. To calculate this algebra of conscience and prevent what the model calls first-tiered bias, the AI requires highly spiral-literate prompts. It can surface cross-stage patterns that humans miss, predicting the human ripple effect of policy before a decision is ever finalized. Pretty wild, right?
Finally, Section 6, Designing Systemic Policy.
The absolute crucial takeaway for policymakers and organizational leaders here is that we have to move away from governing by gut instinct and universal talking points. We need to stop asking if an issue is simply a standalone problem because the data proves that's the wrong lens. Instead, ask yourself what breaks when complex challenges are framed as singular threats. And more importantly, how do you design policy frameworks that preserve systemic thinking and not just basic border clarity? Once you start viewing the world through this dynamic adaptive lens, you are never going to look at a policy debate the exact same way again. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.